Muito bem, como eu disse, então, dando sequência a esse primeiro dia
So continuing the first day of the 6th Forum of Development ABDE, we'd like to invite Régis Marodon from the French Development Agency, who will present to us on the database of development banks in the world, with comments from Sergio Gusmão, President of ABDE. Mr. Régis Marodon, welcome. Good afternoon.
Boa tarde a todos.
Good afternoon.
Eu não falo português, por isso vou apresentar em inglês.
So I will present in English, all right?
So, well, first of all, many thanks to ABDE and to Sergio to give me the opportunity to present you the first comprehensive database ever on public development banks and DFIs. And let me start maybe with what may seem as the most obvious, but also quite a complex question, in fact. What is exactly a public development bank and a DFI? How do you define their perimeter? Is it the size, the mandate, the capital structure, the nature of the activity, the business model, the autonomy, the financial instruments that they are mobilizing? In fact, the first challenge for the database was really to establish again, for the first time, a proper definition that would unify all this population of public development banks and DFIs and so many other institutions of the same nature under the same flag. And to do that, we had to go through a comprehensive review of the literature. It was quite a research already, and I would like to share with you the first conclusion on that. And what is today our most advanced definition, of course, the debate is still open. We see 5 criteria, and all of them should be there at the same time to define an institution as part of this coalition. Well, the first one, and nothing new here, is that they should have a separate legal personality, separate financial account, separate personnel, because we want to distinguish them from government credit programs or from bilateral aid agencies that may or may not have a legal status, but that have usually performing programs in a very different way. The second criteria is that they should deploy financial instruments that ensure financial disciplines of clients, instruments such as loans, equities, guarantees, so many of them, but the clients are, in fact, the ones that are sustaining the development bank or the DFI activity. Again, in distinction with pure grant-making programs or aid agencies. Now, the third criteria that we used is that their funding source should go beyond periodical budgetary transfers from government. Although DFIs can enjoy government transfers, but they should have financial liabilities on their balance sheet. And again, it will distinguish them from pure executing agencies that primarily receive and execute government budgetary transfer. Now, the fourth criteria is that they have a public policy-oriented official mandate. I mean, in fact, they are not profit-driven commercial banks. They are not even profit-driven at all. They have to find some financial equilibrium, but they have to proactively set a public-oriented policy. I'll come back to that. Now, the fifth criteria, probably the most difficult to assess, is that one way or another, they should be public, meaning public in the European name, meaning that they should enjoy a government sponsorship. Either the government has established the bank or the institution, they sit at the board, they have a golden chair or not, they have the majority, they play a steering role in pursuing the development-oriented mandate, they provide support, guarantees in fundraising, one way or another, government is there. So taking into account these 5 criteria, and based on a thorough review of what exists on the web, especially, and I want here to mention the excellent partnership between AFD and the Institute of Structural Economics of the University of Beijing, which is our partner in the building of this database, which is a work in progress. Let me share with you now in a second step, what are some of the key findings that we have in the base? Well, the first thing is that we were amazed to see that, in fact, public development banks are the last report that was produced by the World Bank was based on roughly 150 development banks, out of which they were able to really trace 82 of them in this very interesting inception report that the World Bank produced on these kind of institutions. Well, together with the University of Beijing, we found more than 500 of them, 500 around the world, from about 150 countries, and with total assets of nearly 12 trillion, which is quite enormous. I mean, it represents that, the annual contribution of these banks, these development banks, to the financing of global accounts for about 10% in 2018 of this global investment. And I'm sure 2019, and even the more so 2020 with the COVID crisis, we'll see this figure probably on the higher side. Now, a third remark is that this landscape of development banks worldwide is clustered around a few large institutions, should I say even mega institutions in the case of some of them, and a myriad of small banks. If you take on this total of 500 development banks, only 143 have a balance sheet that exceeds 3 billion. And these 143 represent 98% of listed assets. So it means that the majority of development banks are small. About 250 of them have total assets of less than 1 billion. And together, they do not even represent 1% of PDB's total assets. This is also a very interesting finding. Now, I was just mentioning that some of them are mega bank. And here I want to, of course, mention China Development Bank, which is the largest public development bank in the world. Total assets in 2019 was 2.4 trillion. Well, it's comparable with the largest private American bank, JP Morgan Chase. If you take the three leading China's development banks, you reach 4 trillion in total assets, which is just enormous. I mean, to give an idea on this large figure, it's about the GDP of the whole of South America, Brazil included. So, and these three banks, Chinese bank, are 35% of the global assets of the whole family of development banks. Now, interestingly enough, on the other side of the ocean, if you take the development banks of the 27 European Union members, including the European Investment Bank and, of course, the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, both regional banks of Europe, as you know, we have a total of roughly $1 billion in assets. So it's roughly the same order of magnitude as the three leading Chinese development banks. But very interesting to see that, of course, in Europe, the number of development banks is much more numerous, but the total size, in fact, is quite comparable, meaning that both this region would give tremendous importance to the mandate and the role of development banks. Now, for the sake of the conference, I had a look at Brazil. Brazil is a very interesting country because it's using a development bank as a crucial tool for development, and it's not at the ABDE association that I really need to remind that. And we're not talking, of course, of the large BNDES, the member of IDFC, but in the database, we have identified 21 institutions that fits our criteria in Brazil. For instance, the various agencies of local development, they do qualify. They don't have large assets generally, but they really perform a very important role, as this conference, by the way, is also demonstrating, in particular in terms of financial inclusions and counter-cyclical role, as we have heard from some of the participants, Paraná in particular, in these very difficult days of the COVID. And of course, institutions like BDMG and here reaching also to the leadership of Sergio, are increasingly active on the international scene. I mean, they did participate in the Finance in Common Summit, as Rémi Rioux, my CEO, mentioned this morning, and they are really making a point on the role of subnational development banks when, changing the way we are financing development, tackling the transition challenges and the SDGs alignment that we are all facing these days. Now, as I just said, governments are keen to establish development banks when they want to tackle a market failure or a crisis. For the sake of the database, we have identified 11 areas of market failure where public development banks are really called for action. I mean, this will sound very familiar, of course, to the Brazilian development banks, but I think one very interesting aspect of the database will be to enable for this whole family of 500 banks to see what of this market failure are they attacking and what is the priority to them. I'm not going to quote all of them. It will be published soon, but it goes from, of course, SME investments, promoting of that. I mean, it's usually one of the central mandates of most development banks, but also support to rural farmers, development of economic infrastructure, financial inclusion, social housing, just naming so many of them. One important one is regional integration, which is usually the mandate of regional banks like CAF in Latin America and the EIB in Europe. This is also quite a very important and growing family of development bank. Now, in the database, thanks to all the data we collected, again with the analyst of the University of Beijing, going through all the activity reports, all the website of this institution, we were able also to propose a structure for different category of development banks, and therefore proposing a mapping for that. As you know, we have, as I just mentioned, we have 3 categories of ownership. Some of the banks are multinational, some are purely national, and some are subnational, belonging to local governments. We have 4 geographical scope for which they operate. They can be global, they can be subcontinental or regional, they can be national, or they can be local, concentrating on the local territory within national frontiers. They can have various mandates, as I said, and attack various market failure. Well, this gives us a whole possibility of mapping this, but because of course there are some overlaps, mapping all this institution, thanks also to the financial data that we are collecting. We are collecting the size of assets, the size of equities, the profit that they're making of the year, and when available, also the net interest income for them. Now, as a conclusion to this very short and rapid presentation, there is much more, of course, in the base. I want to mention that collecting the 2,000 activity reports with some past perspective that we found online, we use material to develop a very innovative tool to assess the alignment of banks with the Sustainable Development Goals, SDGs. We are in the process of developing a machine learning system whereby we teach the program to understand the SDG vocabulary, not just the words. I'm talking about the semantic universe related to the SDGs. So the machine is now capable of reading the reports extensively and provide us with the probability, if you prefer, a sort of level of certitude that the annual activity report mention a specific SDG or family of SDG. I mean, it's very interesting because there you can see what the bank is talking about and what in its activity the bank is reporting about. The first results and a more precise description of this innovative methodology is already available online. It was produced for the first Finance in Common Summit last November. We're still working on it. intensively. I mean, we have the best analysts working on that, the best machine learning specialists. We hope to be able to present the conclusion of this more advanced version of the machine learning system during the next summit of Development Bank, which is to be organized in November 2021 in Roma, under the auspices of the Cassa dei Depositi Prestiti of Italy. So I will conclude on that. This date is the one you want to mark in your agenda. I hope to see you all to participate to this newly formed coalition of the financing system that Remy described this morning. And I'll stop my presentation here. More than welcome to take a few questions, if any.
Muito bem, nossos sinceros agradecimentos ao senhor Régis Marodon.
For the very enriching presentation and data and information that provide a precise notion about the role of development banks in the world, and also the fostering of very encouraging surveys and studies and research developed by these institutions. Now for comments on this presentation, Mr. Sergio Gusmão. Thank you. Thank you, Adagisa. And good afternoon, Professor Régis, a great partner. On behalf of ABDE and the Development Forum, thank you, first of all, for the excellent presentation. It has allowed us to view very clearly the size, the diversity, and the capacity for mobilization of the 453 institutions mapped in this pioneering effort led by the French Development Bank in partnership with the Institute for Structural Economy of the University of Beijing. This is the result of a very long and complex work on collection and systematization of the data, and this effort will allow scholars and governments and the public in general to know more about these institutions, our institutions, and make the most of their potential. As we explored along this morning, the Sustainable Development Goals will provide the path for the discussions of this forum. And so the discussion on the algorithm that will allow the work of the mapped banks to be referenced by the SDGs, and also the automated analysis algorithm, which will facilitate comparisons and deeper analysis of figures in a near future, making more accessible the information on the operations and impacts of development banks, contributing also for this distinguished group of institutions to achieve greater levels of legitimacy and support from society in general and from governments that maintain them, also allowing our private partners to learn more about our work, identify new frontiers for partnership. This tool will provide important partnership with ABDE in the efforts of the association, and we are ready to collaborate as we have been doing with the sharing of information for this research. Once again, I would like to thank you, Professor Régis, and the whole team of the French Development Agency and the university also for the work done, and I am at your service for us to continue working in this partnership. Thank you very much. We are going to continue and by thanking you once again for your participation. I would like to thank the participation of Régis Marodon and brilliant Mr. Régis Marodon. Thank you once again for your participation in the first day of our development forum. Thank you very much. So we have come to the end of the first day, and we'd like to thank you for the participation, for your participation. I'd like to say goodbye now, and tomorrow we will meet again at 9 in the morning, but I should ask our president for the official closing of the first day of the ABDE Development Forum. The floor is yours, Sergio Gusmão. Thank you, Adalgis. We had an excellent morning of discussions showing the importance and relevance of this forum for discussion of sensitive topics for development of Brazil. And in the opening panel, President Montezano from BNDES highlighted the impact and of the actions of development banks, highlighting diversification of financial instruments used in response to the pandemic and expansion of the efficacy and reach of actions employed. We also heard a message from the Deputy Secretary General of UN, Mohammed, one of the main global leaders on sustainable development. According to her, development banks play a crucial role in the financing of sustainable development. The resources, financial resources mobilized by these banks will be the heart of a fair and green and equitable recovery. Rebecca highlighted the importance of the international community and cooperation for overcoming the crisis, especially through access to vaccination. We will not necessarily have a lost decade because there are opportunities to be explored on the basis of bilateral and collaborative dialogue. Richard Martinez highlighted the importance of taking care of structural and conjunctural issues at the same time to overcome challenges in the growth of the region. Digitalization, innovation, small and medium companies, and climate change are central topics that should be part of the response strategies that are being addressed by the Inter-American Development Bank. Also, Professor Stephanie Griffin-Jones, and President of IDFC and FD, and we were also able to discuss the roles and challenges of development banks in a world in transition, including the necessary bridge that they must provide between local priorities and global agendas jointly around common goals. President Hemi also made an important announcement that we will have a second edition of Financing in Common this year, held in Italy. In the fifth session of this morning, we had leaders from the development system, our partners in ABDE, mediated by Ottaviano Canuto. They discussed the role of the national development system in the current crisis and the resumption of growth. Also, we had a presentation on the mapping of development institutions by Professor Remy. And I'd like to invite you all to join us throughout the week for discussions on geopolitical issues of a world in transition, the challenges for modernization of the system, and the necessary elements to guarantee an inclusive transition and also the future of development in our country. And so tomorrow we'll meet again at 9 o'clock for a special interview with Professor José Ocampo from the Columbia University, who will talk to us about the challenges and trends of a world in transition. Good afternoon.